Hello, my name is Tim, and this is The Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to be taking a look at writing fundamentals. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the book, The Elements of Style. This is the 4th edition. It was originally created by William Strunk Jr. It was then edited later by E.B. White. Before we get into the actual text of the book, I just want to clarify something. So the idea is that as writers, when we first start, we don't know anything. And that's a really good way of thinking about how we approach writing. David Eddings is quoted to say, "Write 1,000,000 words, the absolute best you can write, and then throw it all away and bravely turn your back on what you've written. At that point, you're ready to begin." Now, there is some debate on who actually said it first, but I linked a blog that somebody who went into look into it a little bit deeper. She kind of believes that multiple people actually came up with this independently. So this kind of isn't necessarily one master saying to another, but rather a master looking back over his life, seeing the work that he's done and realizing at 1,000,000 words, he fully began to understand what it meant to write. So regardless of where you are in your writing journey, personally, I'm less than 600,000 words into my 1,000,000 words. Now, I've written a lot, but compared to somebody who's written several million words, I mean, even if we just take a look at one book from J.R.R. Tolkien, how many millions of books did he write? Or George R.R. Martin, his books are, massive. So these are just a way of orienting ourselves in the right direction. So let's get into it. Introduction. So The Elements of Style has pretty much just been the go-to writing guide for the American English. It was originally written in 1918, and then in 1959, it was rewritten by E.B. White. He revised it, and it's been what we have so far for a go-to of understanding the fundamentals of writing. Basically, every college has been using this as the foundational text to understand clear and concise writing. That's not to say that everything that we are going to be talking about or everything that's in the book is going to be applicable to what we do or how we understand it. But in order to know how to properly display art, you have to understand the fundamentals. Every master, whether it is writing, painting, sculpting, they have to understand the fundamentals before they can build off of it to tell their own story in their own voice. That's why fundamentals are so important. It is an old observation that the best writers sometimes disregard the rules of rhetoric. When they do so, however, the reader will usually find in the sentence some compensating merit, attained at the cost of the violation. Unless he is certain of doing as well, he will probably do best to follow the rules after he has learned, by their guidance, to write plain English adequate for everyday use. Let him look for the secrets of style to study the masters of literatures. Basically, that's kind of what I was saying, is that when you take a look at those who have mastered it, they don't just toss out the rules willy-nilly or without cause. There's usually something underneath the meaning of what they are trying to do. And usually it's when we try to tell a story, it's the most important that we get across what we are trying to say to our readers. Now, when the masters toss out those rules, they aren't tossing out those rules because they have no value, but rather they are able to tell a story in the tossing out of those rules. It's kind of hard to understand if you don't read and pay attention and figure out why they are doing the things that they're doing. So this is something that we have to completely understand for ourselves, is that how we take a look at the rules is not just something that needs to be broken. A lot of writers, when they first start and try to get published, they think that the rules don't apply to them, that their stories are able to do well without following the rules. The problem is that for the writer, we have already an ingrained bias in how we view our stories. We view our stories as complete because in our minds, they are. In our minds, we fill in the gaps, we fill in the holes. We know what we're trying to say, but the reader doesn't have that. The reader doesn't have the ability to understand what we're trying to say. And until technology comes along where we can actually, transfer thoughts one to another, we have to abide by rules so that everybody, or at least the most people, can understand the story we're trying to tell. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to do with these books is I'm not going to necessarily read the whole books because that's, stealing. What I plan on doing is every book is I actually pull out bits and pieces that could help us become better writers. As always, I highly suggest you read the whole book yourself. I have linked a copy from Project Gutenberg in the description below. So if you want a copy of Elements of Style, go ahead and take a look. It's not going to be exactly the same as what I'm looking at now because I am working with the 4th edition, and that might be the 1st or 2nd edition. So make sure that you are aware of that before you go into it. But it is free. It's there to use. I'm going to be doing my best to make sure that every book that I talk about has a free version available, even if it's something like Amazon Unlimited or finding it on a website for libraries or something like that. Unfortunately, that's just not going to be the case for everything. But every single book I look at, I highly suggest everybody takes a look at it, the whole thing, so that you can figure out what's going to help you in your writing. Chapter 2, Elementary Rules of Usage. Point number 5, do not join independent clauses by comma. If 2 or more clauses, grammatically complete, and not joined by conjunction, are to form a single compound sentence, the proper mark of punctuation is a semicolon. Now, semicolon is one of those punctuation marks that we don't really use too often. It's something that we could enhance our writing with. For example, Stevenson's romances are entertaining, semicolon, they are full of exciting adventures. As well as, it is nearly 5:30, semicolon, we cannot reach town before dark. It is, of course, equally correct to write the above as 2 sentences each, replacing semicolons by periods. Stevenson's romances are entertaining, period. They are full of exciting adventures. It is nearly 5:30, period. We cannot reach town before dark. If a conjunction is inserted, the proper mark is a comma. Stevenson's romances are entertaining. 4. They are full of exciting adventures. It is nearly 5:30, comma, and we cannot reach town before dark. Notice the 4 and end are the conjunctions here. A comparison of the 3 forms given above clearly shows the advantage of the first. It is, at least, in the examples given, better than the second form, because it suggests a close relationship with those 2 statements in a way that the second does not attempt, and better than the third. Because briefer and therefore more forcible, indeed it may be said that this simple method of indicating a relationship between statements is one of the most useful devices of composition. The relationship, as above, is commonly one of cause or consequence. In this way, we can write the connections between one clause and another clause without actually explicitly stating that relationship. If we take this and we use this in our writing so that we are allowing the reader to see the connection without actually stating it, that is a lot more powerful than trying to just say, hey, these are related by saying. The old adage, we always want to be showing, and one of the ways that we can show is by using semicolons. A participle phrase at the beginning of the sentence must refer to the grammatical subject. Walking slowly down the road, he saw a woman accompanied by 2 women. The word walking refers to the subject in the sentence, not the woman. If a writer wishes to make it refer to the woman, he must recast the sentence or rewrite the sentence. He saw the woman accompanied by 2 children walking slowly down the road. The participle phrase, preceded by the conjunction or by a preposition, nouns and apposition, adjectives, and adjective phrases come under the same rule if they began the sentence. What they're trying to say is, because we want the object participle phrase at the beginning, we want the subject of the phrase at the front, not towards the rear. Throughout the book, they do a lot of examples
So I've included some of these so we can understand what they're trying to say. I think it's very important that we just don't take it as an abstract, but also see it in how it's actually applied. In a lot of cases, this helps deepen our understanding of it. On arriving to Chicago, his friends met him at the station. Doesn't sound as well as when he arrived in Chicago, his friends met him at the station. A soldier of proved valor, they entrusted him with the defense of the city. A soldier of proved valor, he was entrusted with the defense of the city. Young and inexperienced, the task seemed easy to me. Young and inexperienced, I thought the task easy. Without a friend to counsel him, the temptation proved irresistible. Without a friend to counsel him, he found the temptation irresistible. Every single time I hear the differences, the second ones always seem to soothe rather than to irritate. There's an instinct that people that have read a lot that allows us to write the stories in a way that's similar. When you write it one way, there's something that's off about how we read them. For the first one, arriving in Chicago, his friends met him at the station. Doesn't sound as well as, or when he arrived in Chicago, his friends met him in the station. There's something off about the first one as opposed to the second one. And that's what they're trying to get.
Use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than passive. I will always remember my first visit to Boston. This is much better than my first visit to Boston will always be remembered by me. The latter sentence is less direct, less bold, and less concise. If the writer tries to make it more concise by omitting by me, my first visit to Boston will always be remembered, it becomes an indefinite. Is it the writer or some other person undisclosed or the world at large that will always remember this visit? This rule does not, of course, mean that the writer should entirely disregard the passive voice, which is frequently convenient and sometimes necessary. So basically a way of thinking about that is when you distill something, that's basically the same concept here, is we want to take something and we want to boil it down, as it were, to render it down, to get out all the extra parts, the unnecessary parts. The goal of writing is not to say so many words, but rather to say the story, to say what you're trying to say with as few words as possible. Without that, our words are, what we say becomes bloated, becomes unreadable, it becomes cumbersome to read. Ideally, the goal is your writing is that your reader is barely understanding that they're actually reading. You want it to be smooth, silky, reading words as if they're not actually there. Not even remember that they read the word. That's why the word said is so important in our writing, is because it's so easy to not even realize it's said, but understand it's being used, or that the story is using the word said. It's one of those invisible words that the masters will say, always use said, use other words like moaned or growled sparingly. That's the part of active voice which is so important, and we'll go over a book later called Write Tight. We'll discuss how to whittle down our words as much as possible. Stephen King says is that he always takes out 10% of his story before even thinking about publishing it. The dramatists of the Restoration are little esteemed today. Modern readers have little esteemed for the dramatists of the Restoration. The first would be the right form in a paragraph on dramatists of the Restoration. The second in a paragraph on tastes of modern readers. Let's take a look at those phrases again. By switching things around, we are changing what the purpose of the sentence is. Like it says here, the first is the right form in a paragraph on the dramatists of the Restoration, whereas the second has more to do with modern readers and their taste of the dramatists of the Restoration. The need of making a particular word the subject of the sentence will often, as in these examples, determine which voice is to be used. As a rule, avoid making one passive depend directly on another. Gold is not allowed to be exported, or it was forbidden to export gold, or the export of gold was prohibited. Not allowed is weaker than using something like forbidden or prohibited. Those are power words that we use in our writing to emphasize what we're trying to say. There are words, like I said earlier, about silent words or quiet words or invisible words. There are loud words, words like prohibited, forbidden. We want to use power words to our best advantage, while at the same time using silent words or invisible words to equal advantage. He is proved to have been seen entering the building, versus it was proved that he was seen to enter the building. The second one is a lot more powerful, even though there's no real difference in the words, but the locations. The second one is much, much more powerful. In both examples above, before correction, the word properly related to the second passive is made the subject of the first. A common fault is to use the subject as the passive construction in a noun which expresses the entire action, leaving the verb no function beyond that of completing the sentence. What they're trying to say here is that we want to make sure that each word, particularly verbs, have a reason to be in the sentence. By rearranging those words, by saying, hey, make sure your verbs actually carry the weight of the sentence like they're designed to. This allows us to tell better sentences and, as a result, better stories. A survey of this region was made in 1900 versus this region was surveyed in 1900. Mobilization of the army was rapidly effected versus the army was rapidly mobilized. Confirmation of these reports cannot be obtained versus these reports cannot be confirmed. These are all essentially saying the same thing, but with active voice, we are drilling down as quickly as possible to the point. And as a result, we are telling the story, we're telling these sentences in a tight, constrained, quick way that allows us to get our story going and allows the information to be passed quickly. Compare the sentence, the export of gold was prohibited, in which the predicate was prohibited expresses something not implied in export. The habitual use of the active voice makes for forcible writing. This is true not only in narrative, principally concerned with action, but in writing of any kind. Many a tame sentence of description or exposition can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a verb in the active voice for some perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. There are a great number of dead leaves lying on the ground versus dead leaves covered the ground. The sound of guitar somewhere in the house could be heard. Somewhere in the house, a guitar hummed sleepily. The reason he left college was that his health became impaired. Failing health compelled him to leave college. It was not long before he was very sorry he said what he had, versus soon he repented his words. Again, the differences that we're seeing between the original versus the edited versions is almost night and day. We're always trying to say the least amount of words as powerfully as possible. This allows us to push our story, push our reader as quickly into our story and dig in so that they can become part of the world that we're creating for them to enjoy. Put statements in positive form. Make definite assertions. Avoid tame, colorless, hesitating, non-committal language. Use the word not as a means of denial or antithesis, and never as means of evasion. He was not very often on time. He usually came late. He did not think that studying Latin was much use, versus he thought the study of Latin was useless. The taming of the shrew was rather weak in spots. Shakespeare did not portray Catherine as an admirable character, nor does Bianca retain long in the memory as an important character in Shakespeare's works. The women in Taming of the Shrew are unattractive. Catherine is disagreeable, and Bianca is insignificant. What they're saying is unattractive is that there's nothing to attract the reader to those characters, not necessarily that their physical appearance. The last example, before correction, is an indefinite as well as a negative. The corrected version, consequently, is simply a guess on the writer's intention. All three examples show the weakness inherent in the word not. Conscientiously or unconscientiously, the reader is dissatisfied with being told what is not. He wishes to be told what is. Hence, as a rule, it is better to express even a negative in a positive form. Not honest, dishonest, not important, trifling, did not remember, forgot, did not pay attention to, ignored. The antithesis of negative and positive is strong. Not that I love Caesar less, but Rome more. Negative words, other than not, are usually strong. The sun never sets on the British flag. Now, this goes back to that passive voice that we were talking about earlier. Omit needless words. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should retain no unnecessary words. A paragraph of no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason that drawing should have no unnecessary lines and the machine should have no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all of his sentences short, or that he avoid all detail and treat his subjects only in outline, but to make every word tell. Many expressions in common use violate this principle. The question is to whether. The question whether. There is no doubt about that. No doubt. Used for fuel purposes. Used for fuel. He is a man who. He. In a hasty manner. Hastily. This subject with this subject. In especial this expression, the fact that should be revised out of every sentence in which it occurs, owing to the fact that, since, or because, in spite of the fact that, versus though or although. Call to your attention to the fact that, remind you, or notify you. See also under case, character, nature, systems in Chapter 5. Who is, which is, and the like are often superfluous. His brother, who was a member of the same firm, versus his brother, a member of the same firm. Trafalgar, which is Nelson's last battle, versus Trafalgar, Nelson's last battle. Particularly in that last one, it's a lot tighter. It definitely gets the point across a lot faster. As positive statement, it is more concise than negative, and the active voice more concise than the passive. Many examples given under Rules 11 and 12 illustrate this rule well. A common violation of conciseness is the presentation of a single complex idea step by step in a series of sentences or independent clauses which might advantage to be combined into one. Macbeth was very ambitious. This led him to wish to become the King of Scotland. The witches told him that this wish would come true. The King of Scotland at this time was Duncan. Encouraged by his wife, Macbeth murdered Duncan. He was thus enabled to succeed Duncan as king. Versus, now that was 51 words, versus, encouraged by his wife, Macbeth achieved his ambition and realized the prediction of the witches by murdering Duncan and becoming the King of Scotland in his place. Personally, I think that they could even whittle it down even more and by saying, encouraged by his wife, Macbeth achieved his ambition and realized the prediction of the witches by murdering Duncan and usurping the throne of Scotland. There are several less important courses, but these are the most important, and although they do not come every day, they come often enough to keep you in such a state that you never know what your next move will be. Versus, these most important courses of all time come, not daily, at least often enough to keep one under constant strain. There's the second one was a lot tighter and got to the point a lot faster. Chapter 5, words and expressions commonly misused. Now, the reason why I brought this out, I selected this is because there's something as writers that we can easily use this both ways. When we talk about dialect or dialogue, when you have a character who's speaking, by knowing what words are good to use in the way they use them, when we have a character that's less educated or from a specific area of our world, or they part of a group that has its own specific manner of talking, we can use these misused words to indicate or to add depth to the richness of the dialect. Everybody has their own dialect. Every area of the world speaks in its own fashion. There are more that are commonly understood, taken in as reduced in its complexity. Every accent is a part of that. Accents are a part of the dialect. So let's go through a couple that I picked out. Can means am, as in is, are, able, not to be used as a substitute for may. The idea here is, are you physically able to do this thing? Not, are you permitted to do it? When you always hear that whole shtick for teachers, when a child asks, can I go to the bathroom? What the teacher is correcting him on is the proper use of the word can. Yes, it's a trope, it's a cliche at this, but it's kind of important as writers that we are clear about the difference between can and may. Certainly, used indiscriminately by some writers, much as others use vary to intensify any and every statement, A mannerism of this kind, bad in speech, is even worse in writing. Now, we don't see certainly too much today. There are other ones that are literally, that gets used all the time. Folk, collective noun equivalent to people, used in singular form only. So we don't use folk as in folks. Folk is already a group of people. Effect, as a result, means result, as verb means to bring about, to accomplish, not to be confused with affect, which means to influence. So as noun, often loosely used in the perfunctory writing about fashions, music, painting, and other arts. An oriental effect, effects on pale green, very delicate effects, broad effects, subtle effects. A charming effect was produced by. The writer, who has a definite meaning to express, will not take refuge in such vagueness. Now, these are just a taste of what's in the book. The book is not long at all. On Audible, it's a little bit over, an hour and a half. Go ahead, take a look, figure out what ways you can improve your writing by this book. If you have any suggestions on books that I could take a look at, feel free to drop them in the comments. Going to be moving over to the more practical so we can actually take these ideas and actually put them into writing. How we are going to correct our own writing and presenting an idea a lot better. All right, so I just finished editing the first part. Came out a lot longer than I was hoping, so we're going to have to put the practical on the second video. Hopefully it should only be a couple days. This is probably going to be what I'm going to do as far as uploads. The first day is going to be the information, and the second day is going to be the practical. All right, so as always, any suggestion books, leave a comment below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.